Cool. Well, thanks for coming. We weren't expected this much of a crowd, but I think there's still some seats left over there. That's just for the recording. Um, well, thank you very much for coming. We're going to talk a little bit about open source and how what we think about open source and how MongoDB's journey through open source has been in the last couple of years. Yeah, let's just get started. I think we.
You want to say who you are?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that was the next slide. So I can introduce myself. Hi, my name is Joel. I work as a lead in developer relations. We have a booth somewhere over there, so if you want to come and talk to us later on. This is a lot of what I do. I go and meet with software developers at various events. I've joined MongoDB in 2021, so I haven't been there that very long, almost 4 years now. Mind you, it's probably been my longest job in my entire tech career. But I also wanted some help from somebody who has a lot more experience, which is why Rachelle is here to give us a little bit more perspective.
And hello. So I'm Rachelle. I joined Tengen, pre-MongoDB brand, in 2013. I was one of our first 200 hires. I was also one of the first 10 hires on our cloud engineering team. If you were a longtime user of MongoDB, you would have known it back in the day as MMS or Cloud Manager or then Ops Manager and then now Atlas today. And my time at MongoDB, I have been on the engineering team. I then also went on and founded our technical support team for our cloud products. And then I became a product leader for developer experience in our education team, which encompasses documentation, academia, DevRel. And now I currently run our field engineering team, and we write code using static code analyzers and programmatic means and LLMs to modernize legacy applications to Mongo. Before MongoDB, I was a lifelong consultant at systems integrators. I worked at Deloitte and Accenture for 9.5 years. I was on the road basically 100% of that time. And so when I joined MongoDB, I was the second person to have an MBA. So I was one of the only business people at the company at that time.
Yeah, and I've also worked at different companies prior to joining MongoDB. My last employer was Red Hat, so I was very happy to come back to Raleigh again. It's always nice to meet with a bunch of Red Hatters. It also gives you a little bit of perspective into my open source journey as well. I used to do a lot of engineering roles. I was a software engineer for many, many years, moved a little bit more into educational roles. I still write code for a living, but it's a little bit more like tinkering almost these days. So that also probably affects a little bit my relationship with open source. And again, it just gives you a little bit of context on where we're coming from for the rest of this presentation.
Okay, some brief stuff. If you're not actually, can I get a show of hands? How many people have actually used MongoDB in production? Okay, so 3. So companies using MongoDB today, some logos. It's almost everybody, actually. If you're going to be specific, I think it's something like 90% of the Fortune 100. Then I also included some stats. These are actually pulled from our internal metrics, so they are accurate up to today, which is that on a weekly basis for our Cloud Atlas, we have between 45,000 and 75,000 registrations. That's new unique users. Monthly, we have about 1.4 million unique downloads of MongoDB Community, which is our free MongoDB community server, 13.9 million non-uniques, which we mostly consider to be CI/CD pipelines. 1 in 4 developers use MongoDB in production, according to the latest Stack Overflow survey. Our market cap, $20 billion, and we currently have over 5,000 employees all around the world.
All right. Out of curiosity, who thinks that MongoDB goes against open source philosophy? Oh, there's only half of one. Like I was expecting
one guy.
I was expecting a lot more people like coming in with forks and and torches. No, anybody else wants to change their mind still? No? Okay. All right. Well, that's great. That's great. Then we're done. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for coming to our talk.
There is a lot of controversy that came out with MongoDB. MongoDB being one of the first, or being the first one to release the SSPL many years ago. So we sometimes see that feeling when we go to these events where people are somewhat think that MongoDB is not open source, and they ask us a lot of questions about that, like how does that fit into the open source world and so on. So that's what we wanted to address a little bit today. And what is open source really? To me, that's kind of an interesting topic. I've been doing software engineering for a long time. I graduated in the previous millennium, so that's, it's been a while. And like the definition of open source and free software kind of varies from depending on where you are, depending where you're standing from, and depending on the years as well. The Free Software Foundation, many years ago, 1986, came up with this definition, which basically refers to free software not as being freely available. That was freeware back in the days. AKA you could download it on 2cows if you're as old as I am. But it's really about the freedom and what you can do with that code, that source code, and that software. So it was kind of still somewhat vague, but you had the freedom to change the program so you can control it. You had the source had to be made available to you, essentially. These days, there's the open source initiative, which really, I don't want to say dictate, but has this set of rules that explain what is open source. And that's the more standard definition that we use these days. Now, the definition is a lot longer than it could fit on a slide. I really tried, but I just used the headers instead because there's way too much content on that page. So really, it's all about free distribution, having the source code available, making sure that people can use it. So it basically goes back a lot into the free software mindset, but it does add a few things about commercial use and so on. And it's important to realize as well that a lot of those came out before the big emergence of some of the big cloud providers. So the definition might have changed a little bit throughout the years. So open source is politicized. There are some foundations, such as the Open Source Initiative, which I think is a great initiative, but there are some people that are there to protect their interests as well. And there is a lot of those strong opinions and different things that even as part of the Open Source Initiative, that will eventually change a little bit how they view things and how then some people will try to influence, and they'll see how they can influence so that the software definition meets their own needs. But in reality, when I meet developers, and then again, that's a very personal take on that, but when I go at events and I talk to developers, there's a different thing that I see from this, or that I hear from developers. A lot of people are more connected to the free software definition than the official open source definition. For me, what's important is that, well, the source code is available. I want to make sure that whatever thing I'm integrating into a project, I can take a look at it. I can see how it works, whether it's for educational purposes or just for transparency. I want to make sure that I contribute back if I want to, although in reality, I barely ever do so. But I do have that opportunity. And there are some projects that every now and then I'm like, oh, it doesn't do exactly what I need. I want to be able to contribute. I want to be able to be part of that community and to give them back. I also want to make sure that I can actually use that software. That's very, very important. And that's where licensing is so important. We want to make sure that we have the right to use it and that we have the permissions to use it in the way that we want to. And of course, I want to trust that the code will be there and that it will be made available for me to use.
And so I'm the red robot in this slide. So before MongoDB, I only ever worked at enterprise companies. So the chances that I was going to contribute back were pretty non-existent, because in some of the companies that I worked for or was a systems integrator for, this literally was not allowed. So what we were thinking more about is permanence, right? Like, I don't want to start using a library that's not going to be there 3 years from now. Stability. Is it full of bugs? Is it well maintained? Is it using modern security practices? Is there training, right? So sometimes, even though a thing exists, if there's not sufficient documentation, if there's not sufficient tutorials and other enablements, I can't use it. And the other thing, even that extends to, is there a phone number and an email address who I can contact if things go wrong? And is that easy to find? Because I have to put these things through a business procurement process, even if they're free. I do a $0 procurement process. And by the way, like, even though I'd like to try it for free and I'd like my developers to try it for free, I, as a corporate entity, expect to pay a fair price for regular use. And along with that price that I'm paying for regular use, I also expect support in case it breaks. And I want somebody to respond to me pretty quickly in case I'm using it in production. And then as the business owner, the blue cat, the person who is internal, I need to be able to pay my employees that work on this project and not run out of money. And I need to provide them health insurance if they are in North America, because otherwise a single broken ankle will make them unable to pay for their lives.
Sorry, Rachelle. In Canada, we're good. We don't.
Yeah. So we want to talk a little bit about the reality of open source and whether or not pure open source by traditional definitions is even sustainable. And we're coming at it from the point of view of a company who started as an open source project and then became partially not open source by the traditional definition, but still has actually many products that are open source by the traditional definition. One of the things that I think is not well known or understood about MongoDB is our portfolio of products is about 42 at this point, the majority of which are open source by traditional definitions. You can use them, you can modify them, you could print out the source code and put it on flyers and paste it to light poles around your street. And some of the products are not open source by the traditional definition. They are source available. And then others are not source available. So we have the gamut.
And that's kind of the reality of open source projects and a lot of what we see. We've all seen those news come up. We've got those maintainers who really want to, or they start a project and they really want to contribute and they really want to give it back to the community. But it's hard. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of investment. It takes a lot of personal investment, especially if you're starting a project and it gets a little bit of traction. So we're seeing a lot of those projects which have huge potential. And that's one of the things that I've seen as a software developer. Like I want to use a little piece of software. It's great. It works great. It works wonders. But the maintainers they just can't deal with all the requests that are coming in, all the PRs, all the security issues, and so on. So we've all seen those headlines. And there's a lot more to open source than code, and that's one of the things that a lot of people tend to forget. If you want to create your open source project and you want to make sure that it's successful and that people actually use it and benefit from it, you will need a lot more than good code. You will need a lot more than good than well-written code. You'll need documentation. You will have people coming in and asking you questions. If you've ever looked at any sort of GitHub issues on just about any repo, there's a million people asking questions like, hey, I'm trying to do this, it doesn't work. I've got this conflict with library X and it doesn't work and I don't know what to do with that. And a lot of people, they just don't have time to do that. There's maintenance that needs to be done. You need to make sure that you always update with the latest security patches. And there's older version support. You want to make sure that your users that started using that project a couple of months ago, that even with your next release, you're not breaking it so that you can put those security patches on both versions and you keep those two versions maintained, and it just gets worse and worse and worse as you're growing. And in order to make it financially viable at some point, maintainers will most likely need to quit their job. They'll have to dedicate their project. They really, really want it to work and to make sure that the community contributes or gets something back from that product. You'll want to make sure that your maintainers have the money and the availability to dedicate their time to it. And in order to do that, you'll need to do different things to gather some money. You'll need a marketing team to help you out to maybe increase sales if it's sales, or to have training, or if you want a developer relations team. Like, I like getting paid most of the time. So you'll need all of that financial support as well. And open source by the traditional means, by the original definition, makes it really, really hard to actually make money. There are some success stories, but it's definitely not the majority.
The other thing that's not on this list is pure software. So I think when we put marketing on the list, you think marketing like a human. I don't even mean that. I mean, like, for instance, if you're going to have a mailing list of people who use your product and you want to tell them about the latest release and you're not sure if how they'll find out about the latest release is exclusively via notes on GitHub, you're going to want, like, say, a mailing provider like MailerLite. Except for a tool like MailerLite, you have to pay for. Hosting your application, your website, you have to pay for. Paying for Google Drive, even, to be able to store files. Like, once you get past a single maintainer, it actually becomes something that you have to spend money on to keep running. And even as that amount of money at first is fairly small, one of the things that maintainers discover is, like, they need multiple maintainers, and then the amount that they're giving through something like Patreon or Ko-fi, I don't know how it's pronounced, is not enough even for a single maintainer, much less a team of, say, like 8 maintainers around the world, much less the actual cost of, like, some of the infrastructure required to support your open source project. And I wanted to talk a little bit about MongoDB's journey from the perspective of somebody who was inside the company and one of those early hires who was seeing, like, boots on the ground of a open source project that really took hold faster than anyone anticipated. This is the timeline that you will see on, like, Wikipedia. So, by the way, it's also wrong. So in 2009 was when our first version of MongoDB, the server, released. This was also when we filed, like, our corporate LLC documents, which was for a company called 10gen. And then we have 2017 where we went public, and then 2018 where we changed our license to be a business-specific license. That's the view of the world outside the company for the most part. On the inside, it looked a little different, and I think the years in between 2009 and 2017 are the most important to talk about for us as a company. So, as you can see, I joined there on that first green line, which was 2013, for the MongoDB management service. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that service and how that came about. So 2009, we have our first release and our founding LLC paperwork. In 2010, we saw the first really big ORM library get created by a community member called Mongoose, which, if you've used MongoDB before, you're probably familiar with Mongoose. It is an ORM library for JavaScript developers, and it continues to exist to this day. In 2013, we saw the second biggest library ORM integration be created, was Jen Seeger's project for Laravel PHP developers to use MongoDB. And in 2013, we created this service called MMS, the MongoDB management system. We're terrible at naming things, just like all software engineers everywhere. You basically couldn't find us on Google because you would find either MMS, the disorder, or M&Ms. So if you've never heard of that, I'm not shocked. Nothing was SEO optimized. And why did we create the MongoDB management system, a service? So originally, what we first started figuring out is, like, in that time, that's only 4 years, but we got funding, and then it was immediate, not immediate, but, like, fairly soon after, there were plenty of people on that early team who had worked for startups that failed because of their funding ran out. My boss worked for a startup that failed because its funding ran out. That was Turntable.fm. There were other engineers on the team who worked for startups that failed because their funding ran out. And so there was a high amount of paranoia about our funding running out as a company fairly soon. We did not have a support team, so if you were one of the early users of MongoDB, the database, it would not be strange for you to be familiar with the name Elliot. Elliot was our CTO and founder. He personally responded to people on Reddit, on Stack Overflow, and on support tickets immediately in the middle of the night for several years, which was an insane amount of personal accountability for him. But it also allowed us to iterate quickly on our server because he was also the one writing a lot of the code because there weren't many people working on that server. That all being said, we really needed to find a way to make money. And we had an open source database that people were very keen to start using. The amount of growth was very fast. We had no support team. We had no docs team. We had no marketing team. We had no education team. We had no sales team. We had a bunch of engineers in a single room. And so the first way that we could conceive of to maybe make money was to build monitoring software, similar to, say, Datadog, except really much worse, which was that we would monitor your MongoDB deployment and we would give you a bunch of metrics for it, and hopefully people would pay for that. People don't pay for monitoring. Okay, so that idea didn't really work out. What we discovered is that even though people really liked the monitoring and felt it was useful for our software, they wanted the monitoring for free at a very granular level. So now we had actually just made ourselves a sinkhole, actually, of pouring more funding into the thing, which is that, yeah, I want metrics for MongoDB, and I also want them in real time or up to the second, and I want that in a cloud-based UI, and I want API, and I want notifications, but I don't want to pay anything for it. So actually what we did was we just increased the velocity at which we would run out of funding. So put our heads together and we were like, well, what about if we built a cloud backup tool? What if we backed up people's MongoDB data deployments into a separate place on the cloud? This was really before S3 became very popular, right? And we will manage it for them, and we will handle all of that. For any of you who are software engineers who've worked on or worked with backup products as a whole, you know how incredibly complex this whole area of technology even is. We were dumb. Or not dumb, we were all very smart, but none of us had a lot of experience with that. And so we attempted to do this backup solution where you could back up your data to the cloud. And then we actually ended up releasing that on-prem where you could back up to your own data centers. That is Ops Manager, the product that still exists today, which is actually quite popular with enterprise solutions. Around that time, it also became clear to us that the community, we had a huge community desire to contribute, and most of that was around the idea of like MongoDB is not just for JavaScript and the Node.js developer. And so people started building drivers in other programming languages. The driver, in case you're not aware, is the thing that actually connects the database to the customer's applications. And so that's that middle translation layer. So we saw community-created drivers for Java, for Go, for C#. We didn't initially build those. We only had the JavaScript driver, frankly. And so we got a lot of questions from the community in terms of developing those drivers. So we were spending a lot of time helping and assisting. And then that also became like, hey, we as a company don't have a Go engineer even working here. We should probably hire one so that they can interface with the Go community and help make that Go driver successful. Additionally, people wanted standard database GUI tools, right? So they're used to things like SQL Management Studio, and so they wanted something to see their indexes or even make their indexes and to look at performance of the database. Thus was born Compass in 2015. Compass is a free product. It costs nothing. And so, as you can see, like as we're moving along, we're learning a lot of things about what people need in order to be successful with a database. But I'm not even talking about database engineering, right? That's our core product, but we ended up building this suite of stuff around it that we needed to help make people successful with the software, which almost all of it was free, actually. And so, if you imagine the bucket of funding, it's just dwindling. Now, the backup inbound revenue did offset that. We started to hire up a sales team. We're growing our engineering team as we're developing all of these products. We're doing more and more web dev. And then finally, we got to the thing that really changed things for us as a company, which was, you know, the hardest thing about MongoDB and any database, I would say, is upgrades and migrations, right? Which is that, like, people were meaningfully worried about moving between major versions of MongoDB. And we felt like that was a problem we could solve. We'd already kind of done that with Cloud Manager and Ops Manager behind the scenes for the cloud-based products. We were running them, storing the data, like all of that metrics data is in fact stored on MongoDB underneath the covers. And so we felt really confident that we could actually automate this pain away. And when we built the automation piece, that was like a key turning. That was the thing that people were really willing to pay for. If they didn't have to have their engineers take the time to do the upgrades, they were willing to pay for that. And that was the thing that we rebranded and launched in 2016 as MongoDB Atlas. So it combined our monitoring, our backup, and the automation of MongoDB. And in 2017, we went public. So that is the really inside view of what happened, but you can see how even though you may have an open source project that, even a very complex project, you can't necessarily anticipate all the things that your users will end up asking for or demanding or really needing from you in order to be successful.
Yeah, and in 2018, that's when MongoDB went to the dark side. So at some point, there was a lot of consideration. How do we make sure that we can make a sustainable living? And how can we make sure that this project survives? How can we make sure that the community benefits from this project and that people can use it? And how can we make sure that we can guarantee that we will be working on that project and have the money to finance all of our teams and so on? So 2018 is when the SSPL was released by MongoDB, and that's when a lot of people got really, really angry at MongoDB. So this comes from the FaireDB website, right? So you might have seen their booth up there where they're the open source alternative to MongoDB. But what they say on their website is that MongoDB felt that the AGPL did not adequately address the issue of cloud service providers using their software without contributing back to the open source community. So there were some major cloud providers at that time that were considering or started using some software, including MongoDB, and sell that as a service, which makes perfect sense for their use case. However, it did not make a lot of sense for MongoDB. Of course, we want to be able to contribute to the community. We want to be able to continue building all those tools that are benefiting to our community, to our users, but we also want to be able to put food on the table, and we want to get paid for that product. So that's what brought the SSPL and the conversation about that, which is nowadays also a very actual conversation as other companies are adopting the SSPL.
And one of the things that I want to talk about, as you can see, like based on the product evolution, is I'm only talking about R&D, right? And one of the things that we know or we hear is that a great product sells itself. Turns out what sells a great product is salespeople. But it's also true that you have all these other things to think about when you cater to the developer, when you build software for developers. You're not just thinking about sales as in pure sales, you're thinking about distribution paths. And I do mean like package managers, right? You're thinking about, am I in Brew, for instance? Then we have the education piece. How do I teach people how to use my products, right? If you're lucky, which I would say we were very lucky, there were many community users who were willing to just stand up on YouTube and teach other people. Some of those became famous influencers in their own right. But also there were a lot of people who, despite their best efforts, like educated people in the wrong ways to do things. And then we had to generate educational content to contradict the content that was already existing on the internet. You need marketing of your products, and I don't mean marketing in the pure marketing sense of the word. I mean, like, you have a new release. How do you tell 1 million users, right? How do you tell 1 million users at the same time about your new release and to try it? How do you run a beta or an alpha program? Right now, today, I don't know how many users MongoDB has, but the last time I checked, which was about 8 months ago on Atlas, we have 11.8 million unique users. And so how do we reach them, right? Like, how would we tell them about a new feature that we can offer? Or how would we tell them, more importantly, about a critical vulnerability that might affect them, right? So you have to think about being able to aid discovery and awareness and usage. We've already talked about the R&D piece, and then there's also your partners and integrations. Like, how do we make sure that MongoDB works well with Docker? How do we make sure that it works well with GitHub? How do we make sure that it works well with Terraform or Kubernetes or other companies like Tableau or Snowflake? Like, the universe of combinations of integrations and partners is vast, and you're going to need engineers to handle those. and you're going to want to make sure that those are battle proof. Everything can't just be a POC unless you want every user you have to just be a student somewhere, right? You have to actually build software that doesn't fall apart under real use cases. And in the earliest days of MongoDB, that was not how we thought about things. It was just a guy who built a database, who put it on GitHub, and we did not anticipate, I don't think anyone anticipated the speed to which that would take off. And one of the things we said internally is that it did not feel like we were running a company. It did not feel like we were making decisions. It felt like a racehorse where we weren't even on the racehorse. We were being dragged behind it, 1 foot tied to the saddle while our face was just run through the dirt, trying to maybe hope. We weren't even thinking about winning, to be honest. We were just thinking on trying to stay on the racehorse and trying to satisfy all the things that users requested of us.
So a lot of open source projects, and we were kind of looking and thinking like, what are some of the open source projects that we see and how they move through their history as they're trying to get to a mature stage where they'll be able to make it financially stable. And a lot of those projects will oftentimes start with like a pain point. A developer has a pain point, something bugs him. A developer is trying to connect to MongoDB with a new language and it doesn't work. And then all of a sudden that project gets some traction, which is probably the worst thing that can happen if you ever put something on GitHub, is that now you have users, and now you've got to make sure that you help those users, and users can be, well, a lot of trouble. So users will start making requests. They'll start asking you questions. They'll start for asking for an additional feature, and a lot of the time, well, maintainers actually have a life and they have other things to do. So they are hoping that contributors or other contributors will emerge and start answering those questions. But the reality is that nobody really wants to do that, not as a part-time job when you already have a life and kids and a full-time job.
Yes, and our example on this from experience is the Laravel MongoDB project that I mentioned earlier in the slide. That was developed by one person. It became the thing that PHP Laravel developers use MongoDB. Tens of thousands of users swarmed that project. It became his whole life, to be honest. And it takes an incredible amount of dedication if you are a person who has built an integration to one of these jumbo software projects that gets adopted all over the world by millions of developers. I don't think Jens, was actually prepared for that. And then what ended up happening was, at the time when he built it, he had a full-time job, which was not Mongo. And he never did come to work for MongoDB. He kept his full-time job, in which case it consumed a lot of his life. He got community contributors. There were many to that project, but it remained that the person who knew it the best was actually, in fact, him, which made total sense. And so over time, life kind of moves on. Like he, had a family and didn't have as much time as he could devote. So what happened was that open source integration started to lag MongoDB's development. As we hired engineers, as we became faster, that integration lagged our features. And so we started getting pings about that project, not just from individual users like, hey, it's missing this feature, when is it going to come? We didn't know because it's maintained by a community member. But then in addition to that, we started getting pinged by large companies who now relied upon it, who wanted us to intervene. And so what ended up happening with this project is that we, MongoDB, obviously we established a relationship with that maintainer many, many years ago, but we ended up asking, what would you like us to do here? And he said, I would like you to acquire the project. So we did. We, MongoDB, acquired the Laravel MongoDB integration in 2022. And he was able to retire from maintaining his open source integration, and we have taken that on as a company, and it now has 2 engineers dedicated to it full time. So that's project 1, which is that the maintainer has a life, develops a life, and gives up on the project when it has thousands of users. And then what do those users do if there is no adequate replacement?
Another case that we've seen many times in the community is that, again, a project gets started. It's a pet project. Again, trying to help with a pain point. And then same thing happens. All of a sudden, there's a little bit of traction. There's more users, people starting to ask requests. But the maintainer, again, doesn't really have interest in really pursuing that as a full-time project. So he or she doesn't necessarily have the time to address some security issues. But at that point, we've got some enterprise customers or enterprise companies that actually are using that software, and they cannot leave those security issues unaddressed. So they start to patch. So now they have their fork, and they're trying to patch their security issues. And then another enterprise company has the same thing, and they'll have their fork, and they'll start to work on theirs. And now you end up with this huge ecosystem of like fork version of a project, and there's no more source of truth for all of the project. They're all going into different directions.
Yes, and our example here is the MongoDB Go driver. The original version of the Go driver was developed outside of the company, which was fine. We right away met with that contributor. Another example I would even say is the Elixir driver. That's community maintained. There are 3 that have persisted. There have been many in the years, right? There are currently 3 maintained by 3 separate individuals. They are 3 very different implementations. Which implementation should you choose? I have no idea. It's not maintained by us. We don't have a favorite. It would be wrong to pick a favorite, perhaps. I don't know. For the original Go driver, it developed forks over time as the maintainer didn't maintain it. And then we, MongoDB, decided to build our own version of the Go driver, which was very different from the incarnations of the community-built Go drivers, which did cause some problems as people attempted to migrate to the official Go driver of MongoDB, which was very painful for us as a company. The other example I would give is Django integrations. People have been attempting these for years. MongoDB is currently building a Django integration with 2 core contributors to Django, and it's going to take us 2 years. We are sort of midway through that journey. We announced at DjangoCon this year that we had something available for people to try, but it is not a casual weekend project. It's very important to get it right, and so we are finally building our own official integration, but there are unofficial integrations developed by many community members. And one of the things that you have to wonder about as a open source company or even an open source individual who builds one of these projects that becomes very popular is, what do I do about imitations or like incarnations of the software that I built? They're obviously like not our responsibility, but on the other hand, we want to help them succeed. But on the other hand, we don't want to compete with them or pick favorites if there are multiples. And it's sometimes very difficult to navigate for you as an engineer, right?
And the other typical project lifecycle that you'll see coming from an open source project, and this is probably living the dream, right? This is really what you're hoping to get from your project. You get your project, it gets popular. And now, like, you start to really dedicate some time, and all of a sudden, you've got people. They'll start funding your project, and you'll be able to spend some actual time, gather a team. You'll start hiring people. You'll get some investors, and you'll get more and more funding and more traction. But at some point, you'll see some of your competitors start looking at your project and be like, maybe we should build something like that. Maybe we should invest some money into a similar project. And they want to build their own to compete with your product, which is now getting some traction. So at some point, your founders and your core maintainers will have to react to that.
Right. And the parallel here is obviously MongoDB server, but the other parallel, honestly, is Elastic, right? When I put your founders react, that doesn't mean they react well. And that doesn't mean they always react privately. Sometimes they react publicly and not well. But that being said, like, I think this is a common trajectory for an open source project that does become very popular and has to handle the gauntlet of like deciding whether or not to change their license, to build other software that goes alongside their software, and then also looks at a field of both like helpers and allies and also competition because everybody wants to build something that is popular and will sell. Okay, so let's talk about the open source projects of MongoDB that we currently have in flight in case you're not known. All of our drivers for every programming language that we maintain and all of our SDKs are open source by the traditional version. The source is available. They are free to use. You can modify them however you like. In addition, we have many framework integrations, including the AI/ML frameworks. So this includes Laravel, Symfony, Django, Hibernate. Actually, Hibernate's in development right now. It includes Spring, Spring AI, Fast API, Flask. It includes, what else am I thinking? What other language I'm missing? Entity Framework for C#. We just did that in combination with Microsoft over the last 2 years as well. It includes a chatbot framework. If you want to build a RAG app and you'd like to just clone something from GitHub, there is a free chatbot framework where you can put whatever data you want into MongoDB and it will perform a RAG pattern atop of it, and it's pretty robust. There are multiple libraries and app accelerators. Things like I want to make it one line of code to migrate a CSV file into MongoDB and to get data out of MongoDB into a Pandas data frame or a NumPy array or a Parquet file. We also sponsor many open source projects outside of MongoDB, some of which you'll be familiar with, some of which maybe not. We sponsor Fast API as an example. We also sponsor Mongoose. We also sponsor the Common House Foundation, which is a newer open source foundation for Java projects. We decided to sponsor that when Broadcom bought VMware. Assistance to popular open source projects. Our staff engineers have dedicated 20% time to open source projects, and they are available to help out on open source projects that are integrating with MongoDB. And we also have an open source partners team. So if you have built software that goes alongside MongoDB and you want us to help you promote it or give talks at conferences or anything like that, we have a partners team specifically for that effort because we know how hard it is to get an open source project or open source software off the ground without that assistance or funding. Not listed here, but maybe also relevant to some people, we also sponsor PhD fellowships around the world for people who are in computer science programs who are doing research on databases specifically. And now we're at the end.
Yeah, just to wrap this up, and we're almost on time. But yeah, just some of the things that we've learned from open source, I think, is really to embrace the community and the developer community. At some point with the SSPL, maybe some of it was not very well communicated, and we did gather some haters, to be honest. But really, in the last few years, our focus has really been to be involved in the developer communities and really help them and make sure that we are successful, but we also make sure that our entire community is successful as well.
Yeah, and I would say that above all, what we've learned is like the importance of being flexible and also just knowing that how unpredictable it is. Like I said, we did not know. Certainly when I joined the company, I was like, did I do the right thing here? Because we did not know if we would succeed. We did not know if we would run out of funding. We did not know if we would manage to really build a NoSQL database or if document databases would really even be a thing. And I think it's a testament to the technology itself, like forgetting us as a company, but a testament to the technology itself that now you see SQL databases en masse have added the ability to support JSON inside of relational databases.
Yeah, so I think that's all we had. Do we have time for questions? Not really.
Not really, but if anybody has a question, we're happy to chat.
We're also at the booth. We'll be at the booth the rest of the day, so please feel free to drop by. Thank you.